This is the story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, two desperate souls who fell in love in the middle of America's darkest years and chose bullets over obedience, crime over surrender, and death over a cage. They were not born monsters. They did not begin as killers. They began like almost everyone else in Texas at the edge of the Great Depression, hungry, broke, angry at a world that had nothing left to offer them. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment and hit like on this video. We're trying to reach 100 likes and at least 30 comments, and yes, we really do read what you write. Tell us what you think about Bonnie and Clyde. Were they evil or were they something the times created? Your support helps us bring you more real stories like this. Stories people tried to bury. Now, let's start. To understand why two young people became immortal outlaws, you have to understand America in 1930. Factories were closing, banks were collapsing. Men who had spent 20 years working the same job woke up to find the doors locked and a handwritten sign that said, "Closed." Families were living in tents along railroad tracks, not because they were traveling, but because their houses had been taken by banks and their farms had been swallowed by debt. In cities like Dallas and Houston and Oklahoma City, people lined up for stale bread. Children had shoes with the soles missing. Women sold wedding rings for a sack of flour. In that kind of world, the line between criminal and survivor wasn't philosophical. It was just practical. Clyde Chestnut Barrow grew up in that world. He was born in 1909 in Texas, in a poor farming family that struggled just to stay fed. His father, Henry Barrow, did repairs and odd jobs. The family lived for a while in a wagon, literally. Not as some romantic cowboy fantasy, but because they didn't have a house yet. Later, they built a shack by hand in West Dallas, a part of town so poor that even the police didn't like going there at night. Clyde was not born ruthless. He was small, polite, funny, and he loved music. He could play the guitar. He loved nice clothes he couldn't afford. He loved fast cars he couldn't legally buy. He hated being told no, and he kept hearing no. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910. Her father died when she was just a child, and her mother struggled to hold the family together. Bonnie was smart. Bonnie was quick. In school, she wrote poetry. Real poetry. Not just diary scribbles, but real stanzas, rhymes, narrative poems. She wanted to act. She wanted to be on stage. She wanted something bigger than the little world she lived in. She married young at 16 to a man named Roy Thornton. He said the right words at first. He said forever. Then he disappeared into petty crime and jail cells and lies. When she met Clyde for the first time, she was technically still married, but emotionally she was already gone. They met in January 1930 in Dallas. The version most often told goes like this. Bonnie was staying at a friend's house making hot chocolate in the kitchen, and Clyde walked in like he already belonged there. He was 20, she was 19. He was skinny, sharp, smiling like trouble. She had this bright energy that made the whole room feel different. Some people talk about love at first sight like it's a fairy tale. With Bonnie and Clyde, it wasn't soft like that. It was fast, electric, hungry. They looked at each other, and both of them saw an exit. Not a person, an exit. A way out of everything they hated. They started spending time together immediately. Not months later. Not after a long, slow romance, immediately. He told her about cars and about places he'd go if he ever got enough. Money to leave Texas. She told him about poems she'd written and how she refused to live and die in the same 10 city blocks. She wrote about him in her notebook as if she already understood what he would become, and for a short moment, they actually allowed themselves to believe in a future where they would just go west, maybe find work, maybe start over. For a short moment, they were just young. That moment ended fast. Clyde was already in and out of trouble for car theft and small-time burglary. Cops grabbed him and locked him up, and not in some quiet local jail with coffee and cards. They sent him into the Texas prison system, and that changed everything. Prison in Texas in the early 1930s wasn't like prison in a movie. It wasn't bars and visitors and meals on a tray. It was forced labor. It was chains around your ankles. It was gun towers and leather whips and guards who saw you less as a human being and more as an animal that needed breaking. Clyde was sent to Eastham Prison Farm, one of the worst. Prisoners were lined up in the morning, marched out to cut timber in the sun, beaten if they slowed down. Clyde wasn't just punished. He was brutalized. There are reports from people who were there, not from rumor. that Clyde was assaulted, humiliated, and pushed past his mental limit. Nights were full of screams. Some men begged to be transferred. Some begged to be shot. That was the birth of the Clyde Barrow the world would come to fear. Inside that hell, Clyde made himself a promise. I'm never going back here alive, never. Bonnie couldn't stand knowing he was inside that place. She visited when she could. She passed messages. And then she did something that sounds like fiction but is documented. She helped him get a gun smuggled in by hiding it in a package, which allowed him to attempt an escape. The escape only bought him a little time. He was caught again. But the important part is not that he ran. The important part is what that prison did to him. Before Eastham, Clyde was a small-time thief. After Eastham, he was rage walking around in human skin. He was released in 1932. He should have come home and disappeared. That would have been the smart move. But when he walked out, he wasn't thinking about smart. He was thinking about revenge. He had a new mission: never be caged again and make the state of Texas regret what it did to him. He went straight back to Bonnie. She didn't see a broken man. She saw the same boy she'd waited for. But everyone else who knew him said it. Something in him had frozen. He wasn't loud and reckless anymore. He was quiet and focused. Dangerous in a new way. They started running together, and at first the crimes were small. Stolen cars, robbing a gas station in the middle of nowhere, taking cash from a register, and driving off before anyone could call the sheriff. Clyde liked Fords, especially the V8 engines, because they were fast. Faster than almost anything law enforcement had at the time. Speed was survival. Clyde understood that early. But then came Kaufman County, Texas, April 1932. Clyde and his older brother Buck tried to rob a hardware store. It was supposed to be quick, in and out. Money on the counter, no heroics. But there's a rule in desperate crime. There's always a man who thinks he can be a hero. The store owner reached under his counter for a shotgun. Clyde reacted first. He fired. The owner. She wrote that while they were still alive. In early 1933, they were in constant motion. Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, back roads, dirt roads, abandoned farms, cheap motor courts. They didn't have a headquarters. Their home was the inside of a car. Then came Joplin, April 1933. They rented a small apartment above a garage in Joplin, Missouri, pretending to be a group of normal travelers. But they weren't quiet. Neighbors saw men coming and going with guns. They heard laughing late at night, bottles breaking, engines being worked on at strange hours. Somebody got nervous. Somebody called the police and said, basically, I think we have bootleggers upstairs. What arrived was not a quiet knock. On April 13, 1933, several officers rolled up planning to make a simple arrest for suspected liquor running. They did not realize they were walking straight into Bonnie and Clyde. Clyde saw them through the window first. He shouted for the others. And then the world exploded. The room erupted in automatic gunfire. Clyde and W.D. Jones were blasting through the doorway with stolen Browning automatic rifles, powerful military-grade weapons they'd taken from National Guard armories. The police were outgunned instantly. One officer was shot in the head. Another was cut down in the driveway. The sound of those rifles echoed down the street and ripped the quiet neighborhood apart. Blanche, in a panic, screamed and ran with Buck toward the car. Bonnie grabbed money, grabbed guns, grabbed their camera. Their camera. Remember that part. And they all piled into a Ford V8 and tore out of there, throwing lead behind them. They escaped, but they didn't leave clean. They left behind something that would change the way America saw them forever. Inside that apartment, after the smoke cleared and officers finally dared step inside, police found a small treasure, rolls of undeveloped film. When those photos were processed and printed in newspapers all over the country, legends were born. There was Clyde posing with a shotgun across his lap like a king on a throne. There was Bonnie, short and stylish, leaning on the bumper of a stolen Ford, cocky little smile. Cigar in her mouth, pistol in her hand, like she'd been born with it. She wasn't even really a cigar smoker. That pose was mostly a joke between them. But that didn't matter anymore. The photograph became the truth. Overnight, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer just names on wanted posters. They were icons. Men wanted to be Clyde. Women wanted to be Bonnie. Kids played Barrow gang in alleys, the way kids once played cowboys. Reporters called them the modern-day Romeo and Juliet. People who had lost their farms, who had watched banks take everything, looked at those photos and said, "At least somebody is hitting back." That was the public fantasy. The private reality was different. They were exhausted. They were hurt. They were living like hunted animals. Shortly after Joplin, Clyde wrecked a car near Wellington, Texas. He'd been driving for hours with barely any sleep, trying to outrun roadblocks. The car rolled and caught fire. Bonnie's leg was pinned under the metal and soaked with battery acid that leaked and burned straight into her skin. The injury was savage. Her leg was so damaged and infected afterward that she sometimes couldn't walk. Clyde carried her, literally carried her, into hideouts, into safe houses, down ditches, across muddy creeks. He would stop the car, scoop her up in his arms and whisper, "I got you, baby. I got you," while his boots slid in the dirt and his eyes kept scanning for lawmen in the trees. That is not the part that made the newspapers. Now the violence started to escalate. Because here's the truth. By 1934, this wasn't only theft anymore. This was war, especially between Clyde Barrow and the state of Texas. In January 1934, Clyde did something that made him more than just a robber in the eyes of law enforcement. He attacked the system itself. He led an armed raid on Eastham Prison Farm, the same prison that had nearly destroyed him. He and his crew burst in with guns, overpowered guards, and freed prisoners, including his old partner Raymond Hamilton and another man named Henry Methvin. During that escape, a prison guard was shot and killed. That was the moment Texas stopped treating Clyde like a criminal and started treating him like a personal enemy. After Eastham, the order from the top was simple: bring them in dead. The governor of Texas approved putting serious money and serious manpower into the hunt. They brought in a name that still matters in law enforcement history: Frank Hamer. Frank Hamer was not a regular cop. He was an ex-Texas Ranger, and he was known for two things: calm patience and absolute lethality. Hamer had spent years hunting bank robbers, killers, bootleggers, strikebreakers, anyone the state told him to put in the ground. He wasn't loud. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't drink while on the job. He didn't brag. He just studied and waited. In his career, he had been in dozens of gunfights. He had killed more than 50 men. He had also been shot multiple times and kept going. He understood violence not as drama, but as procedure. When he agreed to take the Bonnie and Clyde job, all he reportedly said was, "I'll get them. Not I'll arrest them, not I'll bring them back, just I'll get them." While Hamer was building his hunt, Bonnie and Clyde were getting more dangerous. There are two specific shootings that turned the public against them forever, and both involved lawmen. April 1st, 1934. It was Easter Sunday. On a lonely road near Grapevine, Texas, Bonnie and Clyde were in their car with Henry Methvin when two Texas motorcycle officers, H.D. Murphy and Edward Wheeler, approached, thinking the car had broken down. They were just going to check on what they thought were stranded motorists. That was normal in those days. Rural police helped people on the side of the road. Accounts differ about exactly who fired first. The version commonly repeated is that Methvin panicked, thinking the officers recognized them and opened fire before Clyde even gave the order. Another version puts the first shot in Clyde's hands. What isn't argued is the outcome. Both officers were shot and killed at close range. One never got his gun out of the holster. One fell forward in the dirt and didn't move again. This mattered. Bank robbery was one thing. Stealing cars was one thing. Shooting police officers in cold daylight on Easter Sunday was something else. Newspapers printed the story with fury. Headlines spat words like slaughter, execution. Fiends? One paper printed Bonnie as the cigar-smoking gun mole, describing her as laughing while officers died, something many historians say is false and pure sensationalism, but you know how the press works. The truth is not half as powerful as a good lie. From that moment on, the country turned. It wasn't cute anymore. It wasn't romantic anymore. It wasn't young lovers outsmarting the system. Now it was killers on the loose. Posters went up authorizing deadly force. The message to every sheriff in Texas and beyond was simple: if you see that Ford, you shoot. 6 days later, April 6, 1934, in Commerce, Oklahoma, it happened again. They were holed up, tense, dirty, hungry, always moving. Clyde tried to help a friend hide a stolen car in a barn. Local law enforcement arrived. Not a full raid, just two officers responding to something that looked off. Another shootout. Another officer dead. another paralyzed for the rest of his life. More headlines, more rage, more blood in the dust. After Commerce and Grapevine, there was no going back. There was no maybe we'll disappear to Mexico. There was no maybe we'll get new names and settle down. The country wanted them dead. And Frank Hamer was almost ready to deliver. Here's something important. Hamer did not chase them like in the movies. He didn't drive behind them every mile. He didn't run around yelling. He watched. He studied. He charted their movements across state lines and realized something that most cops had missed. Clyde had a pattern. Clyde never stayed far from familiar territory. He moved in a rough triangle. Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. He preferred small back roads to main highways. He avoided cities with strong police presence. He trusted families of people he had broken out of prison, and he especially trusted people connected to Henry Methvin. That last part was a mistake. Henry Methvin had joined them after the Eastham prison break. He was not loyal in the way Bonnie was loyal. He wasn't devoted in the way Clyde was devoted to Bonnie. He was there because it was safer to sit next to Clyde Barrow than it was to sit in a Texas prison cell. But when the pressure got high, a deal was made. Lawman quietly approached Methvin's father, Ivy, often written Ivan Methvin, and an understanding was reached. Help us stop Bonnie and Clyde, and we'll try to spare you. Methvin's father moved his truck to the side of the road and staged it to look like he had a flat tire. That was the bait. That was the hook. The idea was simple. Clyde was loyal. Clyde helped his people. If he saw that familiar truck stranded, he would stop. The 6 lawmen waited in the ditch and behind brush for hours. Imagine that tension. Imagine the sweat. Imagine lying in weeds, holding a loaded rifle, your heart pounding, knowing that the 2 most wanted fugitives in America might roll up at any second, and you're going to enter American history, whether you survive the next minute or not. No talking. No cigarettes, because the smoke could give away their position. No movement. Just waiting and listening to the insects and the distant humming of nothing. And then finally, just after 9 in the morning, they heard it. If you've ever heard a real Ford V8 from the 1930s, you know the sound. It's not a clean, modern engine. It growls low, almost like an animal. That sound rolled over the dirt road before the car even appeared. Hamer whispered, "Here they come." The Ford came into view. It was a tan 1934 Ford four-door deluxe sedan with brown fenders. Stolen, of course. Clyde was driving. He always drove. Bonnie was beside him, like always. Her leg was still damaged from the burns, so Clyde had to help her in and out of the car. She carried a handgun, but many people believe she almost never fired in the final months, partly because she could barely move fast enough to take position. In that last drive, she was reportedly eating a sandwich, half laughing about something Clyde had said. Small human detail. In their final minutes, they weren't screaming or panicking. They were just driving. Clyde saw the truck ahead. He recognized it. He let off the gas a little. He told Bonnie something like, "Looks like Methvin's old man. Might have blown a tire again." She told him, "If you get out, be quick." She was used to warning him. She always warned him. She knew he didn't always listen. The Ford slowed. It never fully stopped. This is the point where everything becomes violence. Frank Hamer had told his men, no warnings, no surrender call, no hands up. They were not going to repeat the mistakes of Joplin, Grapevine, Commerce. They were not going to give Clyde Barrow a single second to lift a rifle. They were going to end the story in the first heartbeat. The first shot came from Deputy Prentice Oakley. He later said he aimed at Clyde's head and fired because he thought Clyde was about to reach for a gun. That shot hit Clyde in the skull and killed him instantly. His foot slammed down on the accelerator, which caused the Ford to lurch forward violently. At that point, the rest of the posse opened up. What followed was not a gunfight. It was an execution by ambush, rifles, shotguns, pistols. Over 100 rounds in maybe 15 to 20 seconds. Some accounts say 130-plus rounds were fired. Bullets tore through glass, metal, upholstery, dashboard, windshield, door panels, the engine block. The car shook and jumped and bled steam. Branches snapped. Birds exploded out of trees. The sound echoed through the Louisiana pines like thunder that wouldn't quit. Bonnie didn't even have time to scream, according to some of the men there. Others said she did scream, Clyde's name, high and sharp. We'll never know which is true. because memories in moments like that are always corrupted by adrenaline and shock. What we do know is this. When the smoke cleared, the Ford rolled to a final crooked stop on the shoulder of the road. The windshield was mostly gone. The side windows were shattered. The car was punched through with holes. And inside, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were not moving. For a few seconds, nobody approached. These men had spent months of their lives imagining Bonnie and Clyde as unstoppable, almost supernatural. Even dead, they were frightening. Eventually, Frank Hamer and Henderson Jordan moved forward, guns still raised. They looked through the ripped-open windows. Clyde had died instantly, slumped to the side, still holding the wheel. Bonnie was leaning toward him, like she had tried to reach him, like she was still trying to be close to him even as the world ended. Her hand was on his arm, and there, in that stolen Ford in the Louisiana sun, the legend ended. The aftermath was ugly. Word spread fast, faster than you would think, considering this was 1934. Locals heard gunfire and started coming down the road, and within hours, crowds were forming. Not polite crowds. Frenzied crowds. People cut off pieces of Bonnie's hair as souvenirs, tried to pull Clyde's tie from his neck, tried to grab shell casings from the ground. The officers had to push people back from the car because people were literally trying to reach in and touch the bodies of two people who had been turned into living myth by newspapers and gossip and fear. The car, their car, that Ford was towed and later displayed. Even today, almost a century later, that same bullet-riddled Ford Deluxe is still sitting behind glass in Nevada as an attraction. You can see the holes. You can see the torn interior. You can see the dried history. People stand in front of it and don't talk for a minute. It's one of those objects that makes the past feel close enough to touch. Their bodies were taken back to Dallas. Thousands of people go, not hundreds, thousands, lined up to see them. Clyde was dressed and laid out by funeral workers who'd never seen anything like the turnout for a criminal. Bonnie's mother begged the authorities and reporters to remember that Bonnie was still her daughter, that she had once been a little girl who wrote poems and smiled and posed with a ribbon in her hair. Not just the cigar-smoking devil woman the papers loved to print. Bonnie had always said she wanted to be buried next to Clyde. She said it in her poems. She said it out loud. She said it like it was already carved in stone. But their families refused. Clyde was buried in Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas. Bonnie was buried separately in Crown Hill Memorial Park. Even in death, the law kept them apart. Even in death, the world said no. But here's the part no bullet could erase. They became permanent. You can talk about Al Capone. You can talk about John Dillinger. You can talk about Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, Babyface Nelson, all those names from the gangster age. But for regular people, for the people who weren't in Chicago or New York, the people in little towns, in farms, in places where the bankman knew your name because he was about to take your house, the two names that stuck deepest, that felt the most like a story, were always Bonnie and Clyde. Why? Not because they robbed banks. Lots of men robbed banks. Not because they shot police. Other gangs did that too. It was because they did it together. It was the image, the car, the woman with a pistol and a grin, the man in the fedora with his arm around her, the kiss in between shootouts, the poem that predicted their deaths, the wheelchair days when Clyde carried Bonnie like she was made of glass, the long drives through the night on empty roads, the vow Clyde made over and over, they'll never take us alive. The vow Bonnie answered in writing, in her own hand, someday they'll go down together. That's what burned itself into America's memory. Were they good? No, people died because of them. Officers, store owners, bystanders. Families were left with graves and anger that never healed. You cannot tell their story honestly without saying that. This is not a love story without blood. This is not a movie where no one gets hurt but the bad guys. Real people paid for Bonnie and Clyde's freedom with their lives. But were Bonnie and Clyde purely evil? Also no. They were born into poverty so deep it felt like a chokehold. They were pushed through a justice system that treated people like meat. They were cornered, hunted, beaten, burned, and told they would never be anything but trash. And instead of bowing, instead of quietly starving, they chose to strike back at the world that had written them off. They became symbols of rebellion in a time when most people felt powerless. That is why they're still here, in our mouths, in videos like this one, almost 100 years later. Think about this. By the end, they weren't even planning real scores anymore. They weren't getting rich. They weren't living like kings. They were mostly just surviving day to day, sleeping in the car, stealing food, dodging police, and dreaming out loud about a future that they both secretly knew would never come. The last weeks of their lives were not glamorous. They were tired. Bonnie's leg was scarred and hurting. Clyde had nightmares and barely slept. They took turns staying awake at night, just to listen for approaching engines. They were already ghosts before those bullets hit the fort in Louisiana, and yet, in between all that fear, there were tiny moments. Sharing a can of peaches by a creek. Clyde telling Bonnie he'd carry her forever. Bonnie humming under her breath while Clyde drove. Not talking about next year, just saying, tomorrow morning we'll find a place to stop. Tomorrow morning we'll get coffee. Tomorrow morning we'll rest. Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. And then finally, there were no more mornings. This is the real story of Bonnie and Clyde, not just the headlines, not just the photos, not just the car shot to pieces on a dirt road. It's the story of how love, anger, poverty, humiliation, pride, loyalty, revenge. If you're still watching, first of all, respect. Second, subscribe to the channel, hit like and drop a comment. Tell us what you think. Were Bonnie and Clyde monsters who got what they deserved? Were they symbols of a broken time? Were they both? We're trying to hit 100 likes and 30 comments on this video. And yes, it matters. It helps more people see the realities behind the legends, not just the Hollywood version. And if you want more true stories like this, the ones the world tried to bury, stay with us, because history is not clean. History is not polite. History is human. And sometimes the most human stories are the ones written in dust and smoke and stolen miles, on a road that was always going to end the same way. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over the Louisiana hills, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows something irreversible. The lawmen stood there staring at what they had done. Frank Hamer's hands were still shaking slightly. Prentice Oakley couldn't stop staring at the hole in Clyde's forehead. Henderson Jordan tried to light a cigarette and dropped it because his fingers wouldn't stay steady. They had waited months for this moment, and when it finally came, none of them felt triumphant. It was over, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like ending something that had already been half dead. Within minutes, word spread. There was no social media, no live television, just telephones, telegrams, and human voices shouting into the wind. Yet somehow, by the time the sun climbed high, hundreds of people were already on their way to the ambush site. Farmers left their fields. Men on horseback came from miles around. Reporters started arriving from Shreveport and Dallas in beat-up cars, fighting their way through crowds for a glimpse of the bullet-riddled ford. By noon, it was chaos. Women fainted. Men cheered. Kids climbed trees trying to look through the shattered windshield. Someone tried to cut Clyde's ear as a souvenir before a deputy pushed them back. Another man dipped a handkerchief in the blood on the car door for luck. The officers had to draw their guns again, not to fight criminals this time, but to fight the mob that wanted a piece of the legend they had just created. When the bodies were finally loaded into a truck, a boy no older than 12 shouted, "Don't take them yet. I ain't seen her face." His mother slapped him, but she was crying too. That's what Bonnie and Clyde had become. Not people, but spectacle. The bodies were driven to the funeral homes under heavy guard. Reporters followed in caravans. Photographers climbed on cars to shoot through the windows. Some of those photographs, printed the next day, showed Clyde's head still slumped on the steering wheel, his hat blown off, his face calm in death. Bonnie's hair was matted, her eyes half open, her hand still resting on his sleeve. The newspapers didn't censor any of it. They printed it full page, black and white, raw and shocking. People bought the papers faster than they could be printed. Newsboys in Dallas and New Orleans shouted, "Bonnie and Clyde dead," shot to pieces, and entire stacks sold out before noon. The public couldn't look away. For 2 years they had been a myth, glimpsed in passing, talked about in whispers, romanticized and condemned in equal measure. Now for the first time everyone could see the reality. And the reality was just 2 small bodies, broken and silent in a tan Ford that would never move again. The coroner's report listed the damage clinically. Clyde Barrow, 17 bullet wounds, including one through the head. Bonnie Parker, 26, concentrated in the chest and legs. The car itself, 167 bullet holes, Not counting ricochets, Frank Hamer's men had done exactly what they were ordered to do, but later, even some of them admitted it was hard to sleep afterward. Ted Hinton, one of the Dallas deputies who had known Bonnie from her waitress days, wrote years later, "When I saw her there, I remembered her bringing me coffee with a smile. I didn't see a killer. I saw a kid who ran out of chances." Clyde's mother, Cumi Barrow, stood at the funeral, surrounded by a wall of strangers, shaking her head and repeating the same words. He wasn't born bad. The world made him bad. Bonnie's mother, Emma Parker, refused to speak to any reporters. She only whispered to the undertaker, "Please make her look like my girl again." The undertaker tried, but the damage was too severe. They dressed her in a blue dress, arranged her hair and covered the worst wounds with powder and fabric. When the funeral home opened its doors, the line stretched around the block. Some people cried. Others smiled like they were seeing movie stars. The newspapers claimed 20,000 people came to see Clyde. Some estimates say even more came for Bonnie. One man fainted in line from the heat. A woman fainted because she said Bonnie looked so small. They buried Clyde first. A simple wooden coffin, too small for the flowers people brought. On top, someone placed a note, "You lived fast, you died hard, but you loved true." When they buried Bonnie, they had to post guards to keep people from digging up the earth for souvenirs. Her tombstone still carries the words she once wrote herself. "As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you." Even now, fresh flowers appear there every May. While families mourned, the rest of the world started building the myth. Hollywood smelled opportunity. Within months, studios were buying rights from anyone who claimed to have known Bonnie and Clyde. Stories began to twist. Some said Bonnie was the leader. Some said she was an innocent bystander who didn't know what Clyde was doing. Some said she was a bloodthirsty demon who begged him to kill. None of them were true in full, but all of them sold. In 1937, a movie called You Only Live Once was released, loosely based on their lives. Then another. Then another. Each one turned them further from human beings into symbols. Decades later, in 1967, the Arthur Penn film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, reignited the legend completely. That film, violent and glamorous, reshaped how the world remembered them. Suddenly they were tragic lovers again, not killers. The movie made people cry, not condemn. It won Oscars. It created fashion trends. Bonnie's beret and dress, Clyde's fedora and suit. They became pop culture icons. The irony was cruel. The real Bonnie and Clyde never owned those clothes. They could barely afford gasoline. Meanwhile, historians dug through police files, autopsy reports, and eyewitness statements, trying to separate fact from myth. They found that many of the killings attributed to the Barrow gang were exaggerated or misreported. They found that Bonnie's role as a trigger-happy gun moll was largely a creation of sensational newspapers. In most of the major shootings, it was Clyde and his male accomplices who fired. Bonnie was often the lookout, the poet with a pistol she rarely used, but that didn't fit the narrative. The world preferred the version where the woman smiled while bullets flew. Frank Hamer himself refused interviews for years. When he finally spoke, he said, "They asked for it. We gave it to them." Then, quieter. It wasn't pretty. He died in 1955, never apologizing, never boasting. The surviving members of the Barrow and Parker families lived the rest of their lives in the long shadow of that tan Ford. Reporters never stopped calling. Letters arrived from strangers asking for autographs from the dead. Some family members turned bitter, others simply tired, but one thing no one could deny, the story refused to die. Teachers warned kids about taking the Bonnie and Clyde road. Songwriters turned their names into metaphors for doomed love. Outlaws in later decades quoted them as idols. Protesters in the 1970s painted their faces on banners as symbols of rebellion. Even today, you can walk into a bar in Texas or a diner in Missouri and still hear someone say, "You two are acting like Bonnie and Clyde," and everyone will know what that means. They've become shorthand for love that burns too fast, for a freedom that turns into fire. But if you strip away all the movies and music and myths, you're left with the photographs. The real ones, the ones found in Joplin. Look at them closely. You can see that their smiles are not the smiles of movie stars. They're the smiles of people pretending to be larger than life, because life itself had already cornered them. Bonnie and Clyde never had a plan for happiness. They had a plan for escape. They didn't live for the future. They lived for the next hour. And somehow, in that raw defiance, they captured something eternal, the part of the human spirit that refuses to kneel, even when the world has already decided its verdict. And that's why their story endures, because no matter when the dust settled and the echo of gunfire faded into history, the world moved on. The roads they once raced down filled with new cars, new faces, new stories. But somewhere in the American memory, their engine never stopped humming. It's strange on how two people who lived such short, violent lives could leave a mark that still hasn't faded. Maybe it's because they were more than criminals. Maybe it's because they were the reflection of a nation that was hurting, that had lost its sense of fairness, that was desperate to believe in something wild and untamed, even if it ended in tragedy. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow lived only 23 and 25 years. They didn't change the world. They didn't make it better. But they reminded us that love, even when it's wrong, even when it burns, can make people do things that echo far beyond their own time. Every story we tell about them, in books, in films, in whispers, says more about us than about them, about our fascination with freedom, with danger, with love that defies reason. And maybe that's why even today we can't look away from that old photograph, the one where she smiles with a pistol, and he stands beside her like nothing can touch them. Because deep down, we all want to believe that love can make us unstoppable, even if the truth says otherwise. So as the screen fades, remember this. History isn't just about heroes or villains, it's about people. Flawed, frightened, brave, and broken. People like Bonnie and Clyde, who chased a dream down a dead-end road and found immortality in the dust. If this story moved you, take a second to subscribe, leave a comment, and like the video. Your support helps us keep history alive. Not the polished version, but the real one, the one that still breathes. And tell us below, what do you think kept them running? Love or fear? Because somewhere out there on some forgotten Texas road, the ghosts of Bonnie and Clyde are still driving, together, forever, into the horizon.